Let's go ahead and move right along with our video lecture for Unit 6. This is video number 2, looking at our second topic, global conflicts. Alright, so global conflicts. Europe is going to be the center of these global conflicts for most of the 20th century. And we're going to see how the world wars and the Cold War pretty much changed the entire political landscape around the world in the last 100-something years. All right, so let's talk about empires. Now, empires has been the standard political structure, the standard state, the most common type of government in world history, dating back to ancient Mesopotamia, with the Babylonians and the Sumerians and the ancient Mesopotamia and the Persians that came after them. My point is that we've had empires since forever, and these empires have been land-based empires. They've also been maritime empires, but by the beginning of the 20th century, land-based empires are going to go away. They're going to disappear, right? And of course, I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire, right? The Russian Empire, which is, the Tsarist empire. Qing China, right? The final dynasty, the imperial dynasty of China, the last one. And all of these are going to go away by, 1920 or so. There's going to be a lot of different factors, internal and external, right? Economic hardships, of course, especially after the World War. Political disunity, uprisings, right? Whether it's nationalist uprisings in China, whether it's communist uprisings in Russia, whether it's, French and British breaking apart the Ottoman Empire after losing the war, World War I. A lot of these countries had technological stagnation. That means that their technology wasn't as advanced or improving as other places. So there's going to be a lot of internal and external problems that leads to the collapse of these land-based empires. Right? So places, Qin China, that is eventually going to become a republic, right? The Nationalist Republic of China. The Ottoman Empire is going to be broken up. Most of the Middle East will, become mandates or colonies of France and Britain. Turkey will be its own republic. Russia, of course, is going to have the Communist Revolution under Vladimir Lenin and, convert into the Soviet Union or the USSR. There it is, and it's great. And the USSR could be considered the last land empire. It was huge, right? It had all these different countries that were part of it. So it wasn't just Russia. It was Russia plus a whole bunch of other places. And it was, big and bad into 1991. We also see, of course, that there's going to be decolonization taking place throughout the 20th century. Especially after World War II, right, in the 1950s and upwards. So places like India is going to become its own independent country, right? Places like Ghana, right, this is in sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, they're going to be independent from the British and become their own country. And many times these places gained their independence non-violently, with peaceful protests, peaceful non-violence, civil disobedience, passive resistance, right? So Gandhi, of course, is the famous leader of India, but there's another guy, Nkrumah, of Ghana. He was also a non-violent guy. But remember, even though they might have gained independence, it doesn't mean that they were, even though they gained their independence peacefully, it doesn't mean that there was always peace, because we know, of course, India had a lot of violence. Speaking of violence, many colonies had to fight for independence. They had to fight wars against imperial powers in order to gain their independence. So famous examples include Algeria, right, in North Africa. They fought against the French, the Vietnamese, fought against the French, and then the Japanese, and then the French, and then the Americans, right, in order to gain their independence. Angola, that's down here. Angola was one of the first colonies in Europe. They fought against the Portuguese for independence. Kenya, which is somewhere around here in East Africa, they also fought for independence, right? The British didn't want to give up Kenya because they had so many lovely natural resources. And therefore they had to fight for freedom as well. So, we're going to see, of course, with these, decolonization movements, these independent movements, we're going to see many new leaders come to importance. And they're going to challenge the imperial rule. And these men are going to unite their people on their nationalist beliefs. Right, so Gandhi is going to unite India, right? He's the one that's going to tell the Indian people to resist British rule, to boycott British goods, to defy British laws, like the salt tax. Remember that the British said that the Indians couldn't make their own salt. They had to buy salt from Britain. And of course, Gandhi broke that law. He marched to the sea to collect water and evaporate it and pick up salt. Ho Chi Minh, right, this guy, he was the one who unified and fought against the French and the Americans and a whole bunch of other people in Vietnam. Right? And he wasn't passive. He wasn't, non-violent. He was very much violent. And he was also communist. Right? He's the one that leads the communist revolution, leads the unification of Vietnam after the Vietnam War. As one communist country, North and South combined. Here's the guy I mentioned earlier, Nkrumah. He's also one of those nationalist leaders. All these men are Western educated. All these men are part of the upper class, the elites of their colonial societies. So there's a connection there, right? The upper class are going to become the leaders of the next, of the independence movement. Sometimes the independent movement, wasn't enough. And what I mean by this is that sometimes once a colony became independent, there were struggles within that colony to change the colony, to change the boundaries of the colony. So, for example, the famous example is India and Pakistan. Right? When India gained its independence, the people of the Muslim minority of India said, if we remain with the Hindus, who are the vast majority, we're going to be persecuted. We're going to be discriminated. So their leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he is going to fight for the creation of a separate Indian state that's just for Muslims. And this is, of course, the birthplace of Pakistan. So we're going to see that the boundaries that the British had set up in India did not fit the need for the people of India. So they're going to change up the boundaries, right? Divide the country of India into two parts. They're going to partition it, split it up. And Pakistan is going to be created. Bangladesh, which is on the other side, is around here. All right, Bangladesh will be created as well as another Muslim Indian country. And of course, you have the massive Indian country, which is mainly Hindu. Side note, in Quebec, in Canada, right, in eastern Canada, there's a large French-speaking people, and they're French Canadians. And there's been movements for independence from the rest of Canada, which is English speakers. This is the the Quebecian people in Canada. They want to have, their own French Canada country. But it's something we barely ever talk about. All right. Sometimes we see that nationalism isn't enough, especially in places like the Middle East and in Africa, because there was no development of nationalism. Remember that the Europeans had created these colonies in Africa and created colonies in the Middle East based on their needs, right, and completely disregarding or ignoring the needs of the people that they were conquering. So they were forcing tribes and ethnic groups to live together, or they were breaking up different ethnic groups and not allowing them to unite. So what we see is that sometimes there is no nationalism, right? So they have to have some other way to unite the people across the borders. So one of them is going to be Pan-Arabism. Pan means across. And so across all of the Arab culture. And, throughout the Middle East, places like Syria and Palestine and Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and Arabia, right? Those are Arab countries. They speak Arabic there. Most of the people are Muslims. So there's going to be a religious connection as well. So it's not just ethnic. So they're looking to create this super country, right? Not Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, but a pan-Arabic country. But most of these movements never really created countries, right? Even though they united countries or united people across different states, across the borders, but Pan-Arabism didn't create a new state. Neither did Pan-Africanism. There was a movement in Africa, to have like pride in being African. Just like nationalism is being prideful of your nation or your national identity. Well, Pan-Africanism focused on that as well, but focusing on, being African. But again, even though there's an African Union, where all, most of the African countries are part of this organization of the African Union. That's the closest kind of thing we see in Pan-Africanism. There is no, of course, country of Africa. It's, there's dozens of countries in Africa. Last thing I want to talk about is communism. Communism is also transnational because the communist revolutions is funded or fueled by the workers, and workers are found everywhere. So, with the creation of the Soviet Union after World War I, we see the, spread of communism, right, especially throughout the Cold War. And that, again, is looking to unite people based on economic situations or economic goals of communism. All right, so there is an Arab League, right? Most of these countries are Arab speakers, Arab people, Arab ethnicity. All right, so that is the kind of the product, the final result of Pan-Arabism. We have the African Union, we have the communist countries during Cold War, right? The Soviet bloc or the Soviet, supported countries. All right, land redistribution is going to be a big issue during this time. Right, that social inequality between rich and poor is going to drive the poor people to look for solutions and look at the government for solutions to bring some equality, economic equality. And they're going to support communism. They're going to support socialism. So, for example, in Cuba, we see when Castro takes over, one of the first things he does is he nationalizes all of the industries, meaning that there is no private ownership, especially foreign ownership, including American companies who held property. He just kicked them out and said, nope, these lands, these industries, they belong to the people of Cuba. We also see the same thing happen in Egypt with the Suez Canal. Even though it's in Egypt, it was owned and profited to the French and the British. So he nationalized the Suez Canal, saying, it's in Egypt, we manage it, we should benefit from it. So the Suez Canal was also, a target of nationalization. In China and in the Soviet Union, we have collectivization of farmers, right? Those old, rich, landowner social class will be eliminated, many times killed, to get their land and redistribute it to the poor landless peasants of China or of the Soviet Union. And of course, collectivization has a ton of problems, which leads to famine and millions of people dying. But the social inequality throughout the world, the economic inequality throughout the world, is going to push people to look for alternatives, to look for solutions. And communism was a very, very popular solution up to 20 years ago, right? Into the 1990s with Soviet Union collapse. All right, so here we see all these communist countries, socialist countries that existed throughout, the 20th century, 21st century. All right, let's talk about boundaries. Remember, we mentioned boundaries already. All right, boundaries were created by Europeans, especially the boundaries of the Middle East and in India and the boundaries of Africa. And many times these boundaries leads to violence, leads to conflicts. Case in point, let's do a specific example. Iraq, right? Iraq has three major ethnic groups or religious groups. There's the Shia Muslims or Shia Arabs, the Shia Iraqis. There's the Sunni Iraqis, and then there's the Kurds, who's another group, right? And these three groups don't get along. So when Britain created the country of Iraq and created the borders, right, they split up the population, right? And so not all the Shias are living in Iraq, not all the Sunnis are living in Iraq, not all the Kurds are living in Iraq. And these three groups fight each other, they have conflicts with each other, they don't get along. And this, of course, has led to many conflicts within Iraq. It leads to the creation of dictatorships like Saddam Hussein, who controlled Iraq for years and years and years until we overthrew him. So my point is that the creation of colonial boundaries, put a lot of conflicts, in the countries. We mentioned India and Pakistan. People, Muslims in India were forced to migrate to Pakistan, and Hindus in Pakistan were forced to migrate to India. Otherwise, they might face, some levels of discrimination and persecution. We also see Palestine, right? Palestine is this tiny, tiny little country, in the early 1900s. And in the early 1900s, the British started saying, hey, we are going to allow Jewish people to go back to Palestine and create their own country, which will be called Israel. And at the same time that the British were promising Jewish people, European Jews, to be able to create their own country, they told the Palestinian people, hey, if you help us fight against the Ottoman Empire during World War I, we're going to give you your independence afterwards. So they're making promises to different people. And then you fast forward to after World War II, right, we see the creation of Israel. So the territory of Palestine, right, the boundaries of Palestine, created a Jewish state of Israel and the Arab state of Palestine. And they told the Palestinians, you got to leave Israel, and they told the Jews, you have to leave Palestine. Right? Forced migrations, just like we saw in India and Pakistan. And then, once the British leave, what's going to happen? Right? Once the supervisors are gone, what's going to happen? Well, they start fighting and killing each other. The Israelis versus the Palestinians. And this goes back to 1947. So it's been 70 years, and that conflict is still going on to this day. Right? But it traces back to that colonial boundaries that the empires of Britain and other places created. All right, we also see that once the empires went away, there's still obviously a large or a strong connection between the former colonies and the former mother country. We see a lot of migration between these places. So there's many Indians and Pakistanis who migrate and live in Great Britain. And of course, they're going to bring their culture, and they're going to have that connection. There's a lot of people in India who speak English. All right, call your customer service line for Comcast or whatever. Chances are it's going to be someone in India who speak English. A lot of Filipinos have migrated to the western coast of the United States. Right? A lot of Puerto Ricans, of course, migrate to like New York City, for example. And these, of course, were former colonies of the United States, but they've migrated over the decades. A lot of Algerians have migrated to France. And again, these migrations have, left a cultural mark on the mother country, whether it's, Britain or France or America. All right, next. Violence and death and more sad stuff. All right. So we see that ethnic violence has become more and more common in the 20th century, more widespread, more devastating than ever before. And, the first ethnic or example of genocide or ethnic violence where you're targeting a specific ethnic group or religious group goes back to World War I. Goes back to the Ottoman Empire where they went against the Armenians. Then we have the worst of them all, which is the Holocaust that the Nazis carried out against the Jews and others in Europe. There's also one in Cambodia in Southeast Asia, right, carried out by the Khmer Rouge. And the most recent one, still recent, is in Rwanda, this tiny little country, right, where one ethnic tribe was killing another ethnic tribe. Trying to wipe them out. And as people run away from these violence, run away from these, mass killings, you're going to have refugee problems. And you have to set up refugee camps, and those people are going to be in desperate need for help. So here we see examples of those genocides that we just mentioned, those ethnic cleansings. All right, war. First and Second World War were global wars. They were total wars. We see the mass integration of everyone in society. We see the kind of like the globalization of conflict because all these empires, like the British Empire, is going to bring in reinforcements from all its colonies. Like African soldiers and Indian soldiers and Anzac, that's Australia and New Zealand soldiers, to fight in World War I and in World War II. We see how propaganda is going to be used to rally people to war. Famous propagandist was Hitler, right? He gave these impassionate speeches to motivate the German people to fight. And kill the enemy and take over their land, and blame the Jews for everything, of course. We see propaganda, in things like the Cold War and in posters, in movies and comic books, right? Captain America, first he beats up Hitler, then he goes after Stalin, after the communists, according to the old comic books. And these wars, of course, are going to be, many times, they're going to be so destructive because there's this big ideological backing, meaning that people are going to be totally supportive of war, right, under nationalist belief, right, believing your country is the best and you got to prove it by going to war and killing people, and patriotism and fascism and communism. These are all belief systems. These are ideologies, and you want to prove that your ideology is the correct one, and again, you prove it by killing other people. All right, so we have World War I, World War II. All right, this is an example of propaganda. Right, this famous Rosie the Riveter. Right, she is motivating women to go out and participate in the total war. Right, produce goods for the fighting men out in the front lines. Right, this was during World War II. Here we see other posters. Right, to incite fear, to incite patriotism, to incite, support for the soldiers, right? So, this tells you, look, the Nazis are there, the Japanese are there, and they're ready to attack you. You are in danger. You better help them out, right? You better help out the soldiers fighting, right? And in Germany, you have, the cult of personality of Hitler. Just like you would have Mussolini in Italy or Stalin in Russia, right? These larger-than-life charismatic leaders, who are portrayed as the father figure, the Führer, These are the men who are going to lead the country and your people and your family to greatness. So propaganda is going to be used quite a bit throughout the 20th century. All right, conflicts. So even after, throughout the first half, the first 50 years of World War One, of the 1900s, the 20th century, we see there's going to be a lot of causes for war. All right, expansion is going to be one, whether it's German expansion across Europe during World War II, Japanese expansion in East Asia in the 1930s and 40s, right? Competition for resources, right? The Japanese are a little island country that lack many resources, so they have to expand to get access to resources. We see anti-Semitism as a cause, to rally the Nazis, the German people to support the Nazi Party. We see arms races build up, like we saw in World War I between Britain and Germany. We see economic crisis motivating people to support warfare as a solution to economic problems, like during the Great Depression. After World War II, of course, we see the beginning of the Cold War, right, where we have two superpowers left, Russia and the Soviet Union. And this is another ideological competition, right? Authoritarian communism on the side of the Russians or the Soviets versus democratic capitalism on the side of the United States. And both of them are trying to compete with each other for dominance around the world. And they're replacing the former dominant region, which was Western Europe. Because after World War II, Western Europe is gone. Not gone, it's gone in power. The Cold War, even though the United States never fought directly with the Soviet Union, we do see a lot of proxy wars. We also see military alliances come back. So like NATO, right? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's going to be a military alliance in support of the United States. The Warsaw Pact was in support of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We see proxy wars, right? Korea, the United States steps in to protect South Korea. The Soviets support North Korea. When the Soviets go into Afghanistan, we start supporting the Afghans there to fight against the Soviets. When the Vietnamese want to be communists, we step in to stop them from becoming communists, and the Russians are going to help them become communists. When Cuba becomes communist, we try to invade, and then in retaliation, the Soviets build missiles there, creating a crisis. So we do see a lot of proxy wars where these superpowers are getting involved in other countries, and there's always going to be a flip side, right? So if the United States jumps in, the Soviet Union is going to help the other side. And if the Soviet Union jumps in, the United States is going to help the other side. Now, of course, the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. This will bring an end to the Cold War. We know that the Soviet economy was suffering throughout the 1980s because of the arms race, right? And in addition to economic difficulties, we see the famous Russian-Soviet President Gorbachev create new policies for reform, economic reform, and political reform. So Glasnost is the political one, allowing less censorship of the press, allowing for more direct elections of officials. And as the people of the Soviet Union start realizing how messed up things really are in the Soviet Union, they're going to demand changes. And eventually we're going to see that the Soviet Union is going to collapse, and boom, no more communist Russia. Perestroika will be the economic reforms that occurred there. And this is the guy I was talking about, Gorbachev. Right, Glasnost, Perestroika. They're going to weaken the control that the Soviet government had over its people and over the economy. And as more and more of the Soviet people, the residents, the citizens of the Soviet Union, gain access to the outside world, they're going to demand changes. And eventually the government will collapse by 1991. All right, and all these little countries that you see here, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Georgia, all these countries used to be part of the Soviet Union. Now they're independent countries. Russia, of course, used to be there as well. It's independent as well. All right, let's keep going quickly. So war has become a bigger and bigger thing, but not everyone likes war. There's been a lot of challenges to war, and many times those challenges come through non-violence. So sometimes you can protest war through art, and the famous example is of the work by the famous Spanish painter Pablo Picasso. And he drew this painting called Guernica. And it was to reflect the fact or the effects of the bombings that the Italians and the Germans were doing during the Spanish Civil War. So right before World War II starts, the Germans and Italians helped the fascist rebels in Spain overthrow the government. And they do this, the Germans and the Italian military, they do this practice of World War II by bombing Spanish civilians, Spanish cities. And that's what this image is supposed to reflect, right? The horror of getting bombed when you're, at home, getting bombed from the sky. Sometimes the protests are non-violent to others, but violent to themselves. And this is a famous example of this. He was a Buddhist priest, a Buddhist monk, and he lit himself on fire as a sign of protest to the Vietnam War. So some people take these extreme actions to kind of these symbolic actions to send a message, about ending warfare. Non-violent resistance is also there. Gandhi and Martin Luther King are famous examples of these leaders that use these tactics of passive resistance, civil disobedience, that sort of thing. Nelson Mandela would be another example in South Africa. He also practiced non-violence, throughout most of his life, and eventually becomes the first elected black president of South Africa. We also see, places like Tiananmen Square where the Chinese military, are sent in to crack down these student-led protests in 1980s, and people try to stop the military advancing to where the students were protesting. Sometimes war is, protested by creating alliances. So this is Mao Zedong talking with Ho Chi Minh, right? Two communist leaders of China and Vietnam, working together. And they're trying to, unify Vietnam under communism. Right? This is the famous Tank Man, right? He stood in front of these Chinese tanks in an attempt to stopping them from going to where the student protesters were in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square, where many hundreds of students were killed or imprisoned. So this was an act of non-violent protest. All right. We also see that there's been protests for to change things, to reform things in society, whether it's economic, political, or social. So, for example, during the Cold War, we see a rise of the non-aligned movement. These are countries like India, Egypt, and Indonesia who chose not to pick sides during the Cold War. They wanted to be neutral. We see the Tiananmen Square student protests, pro-democracy protests in China, anti-apartheid. Apartheid was the system of segregation that existed in South Africa for decades before it finally came to an end in the 1990s under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. And of course, we know the civil rights movement here in the United States. So even though people have been protesting war, we see many countries are going to be led by war. or by military officials. So we see a lot of military dictatorships around the world. Places like Chile, right? He's going to have this guy called Pinochet. Places like Spain is going to have Franco, and here you see Franco with his buddy Hitler. In sub-Saharan Africa, in Uganda, we're going to have this guy, Idi Amin, right? A military general. And of course, military dictatorships are not going to have any form of democracy whatsoever. We also know that both the Soviet Union and the United States are going to intervene many times in other countries, get involved in other people's businesses to promote communism or to promote anti-communism. We also see that, many times nowadays there's a big, massive military, weapons trading economy, where countries are buying, tanks and planes and bombs and guns, and that's fueling more conflicts. Because the more guns you have, the more soldiers you have to fight. And that's been a problem as well, especially in the last 20th century, the last part of the 20th century. We also see that some organizations, are completely violent, and they think that violence is the only way to solve political problems. So famous examples include the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. They're going to fight for the independence of Northern Ireland, right? Because Northern Ireland is part of Great Britain and not part of Ireland. The ETA, which is called the Basque Country and Freedom. This is a region in northern Spain that wants to be independent from the rest of Spain because culturally they're not Spanish, they're Basque. That's a whole different ethnic group. Al-Qaeda, right, the terrorist organization in the Middle East, they want to remove Western influence from Islamic countries in the Middle East. They want to remove the United States from the Middle East. They want to remove American soldiers and American bases from the Middle East. And they believe, these three organizations at different times believe that using violence was the only method to achieve their political gain, their political goals. And none of these organizations had the capability to either motivate or get enough people, like population support of these goals. So not everyone in Ireland supports the IRA. Very few did. And not everyone in the Middle East supports Al-Qaeda. Very few do. So these are minority organizations that use violence to achieve a goal, right? Whatever goal it is they're trying to achieve. And all of them have failed. All these terrorist organizations, no matter how much violence they use, no matter how much terrorism they use, they've failed. Right? No matter how many times they cover up their faces with masks and stuff, they fail. Every time. Never fails. No. Never fails that they fail. Alright. Conflicts. I think this is our last one. So global conflicts has had an impact on culture. The most famous example I can give you of this will be all the James Bond movies. Most of the James Bond movies going back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s, there was always about James Bond fighting against some evil communist people. And so it's always, so our culture, our fascination in films of James Bond movies, have a lot to do with the conflict of the Cold War. More modern example, think video games. Right? What are some of the most popular video games out there? Call of Duty, Battlefield, right? Shooting games, military games, they're very popular. Every year they come out with new ones. And it deals with a lot of the violence that we see out in the world. Alright, so that is it for part 2. Thank you for your patience and listening to this entire video, because I know you waited to the very end of the video, right? You're still here with me? Yes? Yes? Oh my God, it's 40 minutes long. Alright, that's it. I'm done. And you're done.